The galaxy had been alive with civilization for over 50,000 years. Great ships moved between the stars like silver fish through an ocean of darkness. On Zethkar Prime, crystal beings grew cities from living rock. In the luminous nebula, creatures made of pure energy danced between gas clouds that glowed with their own light. The Galactic Council ruled from their massive space station at the center of everything, where representatives from 300 different worlds made decisions that affected trillions of lives. Earth was not one of those worlds. In the vast database of the Council, Earth had a simple entry: Sol System, Third Planet, Classification, Developing World, Status, Do Not Contact, Reason, Species shows violent tendencies and primitive technology. Estimated time to space travel, 500-800 local years. Priority low. The survey had been done 200 years ago by an automated probe. The probe had watched humans fight each other with metal weapons and flying machines that burned chemical fuel. It recorded their radio signals, full of anger and fear. It watched them split atoms to destroy entire cities. The probe's final report was clear. This species would probably destroy itself long before it could travel between stars. So the galaxy forgot about Earth. But the galaxy had bigger problems now. Something terrible was coming from the dark space between stars, something that had been sleeping for millions of years. The first reports came from mining ships on the edge of civilized space. They spoke of black shapes that moved like liquid, metal, consuming everything in their path. When the Council sent warships to investigate, they found empty solar systems where thriving colonies had been just weeks before. The enemy called itself nothing, but the galaxy named it the Void Swarm. It was not alive in any way that made sense. It was not dead either. It was something else entirely, something that turned planets into more of itself, something that learned from every battle and grew stronger with each victory. Commander Shardsinger Veltar of the Zethkri Deep Fleet had seen the swarm destroy his homeworld. He watched from space as the crystalline cities of his people melted into black metal rivers. The swarm had taken everything beautiful about Zethkar Prime and turned it into machines that hungered for more worlds to consume. Now Veltar stood in the council chambers, his crystal body ringing with harmonic frequencies that translated his fear and anger into words the other species could understand. "The swarm adapts to everything we use against it," he sang to the assembled representatives. "Our plasma weapons work once, maybe twice, then the swarm learns and becomes immune. Our force shields hold for a few minutes before the swarm finds a way through. Every time we think we have found a weakness, it evolves." The luminary delegate, a being of golden light who called herself Dawnbringer, pulsed with concern. "Our energy weapons are useless now. The swarm absorbs any energy we fire at it and uses it to grow larger. We have tried quantum disruptors, reality bombs, even temporal weapons. Nothing works for long." Around the great circular chamber, representatives from hundreds of worlds shared the same message. The Hive Mind Collective had tried coordinated attacks with 1,000,000 ships moving as one. The swarm had learned to predict their movements and destroyed them all. The tech lords of Median had built war machines that could crack planets only, to watch the swarm copy their designs and build better versions. "We are running out of options," admitted the Council's supreme coordinator, an ancient being whose species had been exploring space when most of the galaxy was still covered in ice. "The swarm has consumed 47 star systems in the past year alone. At this rate, it will reach the core worlds within a decade." The chamber fell silent except for the quiet humming of translation devices and the soft breathing of species that still needed air. Fear was a universal language, and every being present spoke it fluently now. "What about the developing worlds?" asked a small voice from the back of the chamber. It belonged to Representative Cleeth of the Merchant Guild, whose people made their living trading with primitive species on the galaxy's edge. Some of them have shown unusual problem-solving abilities. "Perhaps—" "Absolutely not," interrupted the Supreme Coordinator. "We do not involve developing species in council business. They lack the technology to be useful and the wisdom to understand the consequences of failure." But Veltar's crystal body was humming with new harmonics now, the sound of an idea forming. "What if that is exactly what we need? Something the swarm has never encountered before. Every strategy we have used comes from millions of years of civilized warfare. We fight with honor, with logic, with the accumulated wisdom of ages. What if we tried something uncivilized? The Supreme Coordinator's ancient face showed disgust. You suggest we arm barbarians and point them at our greatest threat? They would only get themselves killed and provide the swarm with more resources to consume. Perhaps, Veltar sang softly. But perhaps not. I remember the old stories from when my people first learned to shape crystal into starships. We were different then, more wild. We took risks that no civilized being would consider. We won battles through luck and desperation rather than superior tactics. Dawnbringer pulsed with curiosity. You speak of the time of sharp edges, when your people fought with crystal blades instead of energy weapons. But those days are long, past for all of us. Yes, but somewhere in this galaxy there are species still living those days. Species too primitive to know that some battles cannot be won. Too ignorant to understand when they should surrender. Veltar's harmonics grew stronger. The swarm learns from civilized responses. But what if we gave it something completely uncivilized to study? The debate that followed lasted for hours. Some representatives called the idea madness. Others worried about the ethical implications of involving primitive species in such a dangerous conflict. The military council pointed out that no developing world had weapons that could even scratch the swarm's outer hull. But as reports came in of 3 more star systems falling to the void, the arguments began to change. Desperation had a way of making terrible ideas seem reasonable. Finally, the Supreme Coordinator called for silence. The ancient being's voice carried the weight of millennia as it spoke. Very well. We will compile a list of developing species that show potential. But we will observe them first, carefully. We will not arm them or contact them until we are certain they can be trusted with such knowledge. Veltar's crystal body rang with harmonics of approval, but inside he wondered if they had time for such caution. The swarm was not waiting for the council to make perfect decisions. It was consuming worlds while they debated ethics and protocols. In the database deep within the council's computers, a small entry began to glow with new priority codes. Sol system, 3rd planet. Classification, under review. Status, active. Observation. Priority, urgent. Light years away, on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, 7 billion humans went about their daily lives with no idea that the galaxy was about to remember they existed. They drove to work in metal boxes that burned fossil fuel. They argued about politics and sports and whether aliens were real. They built things and broke them and built them again, never satisfied with solutions that were merely adequate when they could be improved. And in the darkness between stars, something made of void and hunger continued its slow approach toward the bright lights of civilization, learning and adapting and consuming everything in its path. The Zeth-Kree science vessel. Crystal Song had been fleeing for 3 days when its engines finally died. Commander Veltar felt the harmonic vibrations of his ship's crystal hull go silent as the last power cell drained away. Behind them, somewhere, in the darkness, the void swarm continued its relentless pursuit of anything that carried the spark of life. Navigation! What is our position? Veltar sang to his crew, though he already knew the answer would not be good. We have drifted into the Sol system, Commander, replied his navigator, her crystal form dim with exhaustion. The gravity of the local star has caught us. We are falling toward the 3rd planet. Veltar's harmonics turned sharp with frustration. Of all the places in the galaxy to be stranded, they had ended up at a backwater world full of primitive barbarians. The Council's files said the local species was barely capable of controlled flight, much less space travel. They would be no help at all. Prepare for emergency landing, he ordered. Signal the crew to secure themselves in the crystal matrices. This will not be pleasant. The Crystal Song entered Earth's atmosphere like a dying star, her hull glowing, white-hot as she burned through layers of gas and water vapor. Veltar felt every impact, every vibration, as his ship screamed toward the surface of an alien world. The landing, when it came, was more of a controlled crash than anything resembling proper procedure. When the dust settled, Veltar found himself buried 3 meters deep in what the ship's sensors identified as a mixture of silicon dioxide and organic compounds. In other words, sand. The Crystal Song had gouged a furrow half a kilometer long across what appeared to be an empty desert before finally coming to rest. Damage report, Veltar sang weakly, his crystal body cracked in several places from the impact. "Hull integrity at 60%, reported his engineer. "Life support is failing. We have perhaps 12 hours of breathable atmosphere remaining. The quantum communicator is destroyed, so we cannot signal for rescue." Veltar considered their options. They were stranded on a primitive world. Their ship was dying, and the local inhabitants were probably too primitive to help even if they wanted to, which they probably did not, given that most developing species tended to react poorly to unexpected visitors from space. That was when they heard the sound of engines approaching across the desert. Not the clean hum of graviton drives or the whisper of ion propulsion, but the rough growl of something that burned chemical fuel and pushed against air with spinning blades. "Commander," his sensor operator sang with confusion, "I am detecting 3 aircraft approaching our position. They appear to be primitive flying machines of some kind, but they are moving very fast and with surprising precision." Through the Crystal Song's cracked viewports, Veltar watched 3 strange aircraft circle overhead. They were crude things, built of metal and composite materials, with rotating wings that chopped at the air like the limbs of some mechanical insect. But there was something about the way they moved, the way they positioned themselves around. The crash site, that spoke of intelligence and careful planning. One of the aircraft landed nearby, its engines winding down with a mechanical sigh. Several beings emerged from it, walking upright on 2 legs like most sapient species, but covered in flexible materials that might have been clothing or some kind of environmental protection. Veltar activated the ship's external speakers and tried to broadcast a message of peaceful intent, though he doubted these primitives would understand the mathematical concepts he was transmitting. To his surprise, one of the beings responded, immediately, not with mathematics but with what appeared to be a universal gesture. The being raised both of its manipulator appendages into the air with empty grasping digits extended. Veltar's translation software identified this as a probable sign of non-aggression. Then the being did something completely unexpected. It approached the Crystal Song's hull and began tapping on it in a rhythmic pattern, not randomly, but following a sequence that Veltar recognized as a basic mathematical progression. These primitives were trying to establish communication through the most fundamental language in the universe. Within minutes, more aircraft arrived, then ground vehicles that rolled on circular supports and made even more noise than the flying machines. The beings that emerged from these conveyances carried tools and equipment that looked crude but functional. They spread out around the crash site with the efficiency of a trained rescue team. "Commander," sang his engineer with amazement, "they are scanning our hull with some kind of electromagnetic device, primitive but effective. They appear to be looking for weak points where they could cut through to reach us." Veltar watched in fascination as the humans worked. They had no advanced sensors, no quantum analysis tools, no molecular manipulation devices. Instead, they used devices that measured electrical resistance and crude cameras that detected heat patterns. But they were mapping his ship's internal structure faster than he would have believed possible. When they found a section of hull that had been weakened in the crash, they acted with surprising speed. They attached what appeared to be a chemical cutting tool to the crystal surface and began burning through layers that should have been impervious to such primitive methods. The smell of melting crystal filled the air as they worked their way toward the crew compartments. "How are they doing this?" Veltar sang to himself. "The record said they were barely capable of metallurgy, yet they are cutting through battle-grade crystal matrices as if they were made of soft stone." The answer came when the first human broke through into the ship's interior. It was a female of the species, Veltar's sensors told him, though the clothing and equipment made it difficult to be certain. She squeezed through the narrow opening. They had cut and immediately began assessing the situation inside. She took one look at Veltar's injured crystal body and did something that would haunt his harmonics for years to come. She pulled out a roll of silvery tape and began wrapping it around his cracked sections, muttering words in her primitive language that his translator interpreted as something like, "This should hold you together until we can get proper help." The tape was nothing special, just layers of metal and adhesive designed for temporary repairs. But somehow, impossibly, it worked. The stress fractures in Veltar's crystal matrix stopped spreading. The harmonic resonance that had been growing, dangerously unstable, smoothed out into something approaching normal patterns. "Impossible," he sang weakly. "That should not work on crystalline structures. The molecular bonds are completely different. The human female seemed to understand that he was speaking, even though her primitive translation devices could not interpret his harmonic language. She smiled, an expression that stretched the soft tissue around her mouth, and patted his crystal shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of reassurance. More humans poured into the ship, bringing with them tools and supplies that looked like they had been cobbled together from completely unrelated devices. Veltar watched in amazement as they jury-rigged a life support system using components from their ground vehicles, chemical batteries, and what appeared to be a device designed for brewing some kind of beverage. "Commander," sang his engineer, "they are restoring atmospheric pressure to the ship. I do not understand how, but their improvised system is actually working better than our emergency backups." The humans worked for hours, solving problems that should have required specialized equipment and years of training. They bypassed damaged crystal circuits using copper wire and electronic components that belonged in a museum. They patched life support leaks with materials that had no business holding vacuum. They even managed to restore partial power to the ship's systems using a collection of chemical batteries that they connected together with what looked like recreational cable. As the sun set over the desert, Veltar found himself breathing clean air in a ship that should have been dead. The humans had saved not just his life, but the lives of his entire crew, using nothing but primitive tools and an attitude that seemed to say impossible was just another word for, "We haven't figured it out yet." When the human female returned to check on him, Veltar managed to activate his ship's translation system. The first words he spoke to a member of humanity were a question that would echo through the council chambers for years to come. "How did da? You know how to fix technology you have never seen before?" The human smiled again and gave an answer that changed everything. "We didn't. We just kept trying things until something worked. That's what humans do." 6 months after the Crystal Song incident, Earth looked very different than it had before first contact. Hidden facilities had been built in the mountains of Switzerland, the deserts of Nevada, and the tundra of Siberia. The world's greatest scientists, military leaders, and engineers had been quietly gathered and told a truth that changed everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the universe. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the main briefing room beneath the Swiss Alps, looking at holographic displays that showed the slow death of galactic civilization. The Void Swarm had consumed 12 more star systems in the past month alone. Each system that fell made the enemy larger, smarter, more dangerous. "The pattern is always the same," she said to the assembled group of humans and aliens. "The swarm arrives at a system, analyzes the defenses, then adapts its approach to overcome them. The Zethkri tried crystalline resonance weapons that could shatter moons. The swarm learned to absorb and redirect the resonance. The Luminari used pure energy attacks that could ignite stars. The swarm developed ways to feed on that energy and grow stronger." Commander Veltar, his crystal body now fully healed, sang a harmony of agreement. "Every weapon we have used, every strategy we have tried, becomes useless after the first engagement. The swarm remembers everything and learns from every mistake we make." General Marcus Rodriguez, formerly of the United States Special Forces, leaned back in his chair and studied the tactical displays. "You're all thinking about this wrong," he said finally. "You're trying to fight a war against an enemy that learns from your moves. But that's not really the problem." The room fell silent. Dawnbringer, the Luminary representative, pulsed with curiosity. "Please explain, General Rodriguez." "The real problem is that you're fighting predictably. Every one of your tactics follows logical patterns that can be analyzed and countered. You use your best weapons first, then fall back to secondary options when those fail. You retreat when casualties reach unacceptable levels. You protect civilians and avoid unnecessary risks." Rodriguez smiled grimly. "The swarm has learned to predict civilized warfare." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a quantum physicist from Tokyo, nodded thoughtfully. "It's like playing chess against a computer that gets better every time you lose. Eventually, it knows all your moves before you make them." "Exactly. But what if we stopped playing chess?" Rodriguez stood up and walked to the tactical display. "What if we did things that made no sense to an enemy that thinks logically?" Veltar's harmonics turned confused. "You speak of chaos as if it were a strategy. How can disorder defeat an opponent that adapts to every tactic?" Because adaptation requires prediction, said Dr. Chen. If the swarm can't predict what we're going to do next, it can't prepare a counter-strategy. And humans, she smiled for the first time in weeks, humans are really good at being unpredictable. The debate that followed would have seemed insane to any civilized species in the galaxy. The humans proposed tactics that violated every principle of advanced warfare. Suicide attacks using primitive chemical explosives, ships designed to ram enemy vessels instead of engaging at safe distances, weapons that worked by throwing chunks of metal really fast instead of using sophisticated energy systems. This is madness, sang Veltar. You speak of deliberately making your technology less efficient, your tactics more dangerous. How can inferior methods defeat a superior enemy? Colonel James Park, a military engineer, pulled up a historical database on his tablet. Let me tell you about a battle that happened on our world, Commander. Advanced army, best equipment, trained by the finest military academies. They invaded a country full of farmers and shopkeepers who had old hunting rifles and homemade bombs. Guess who won? The aliens listened in amazement as Park described guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, and the art of fighting dirty. He told them about battles where the side with worse technology and fewer resources had defeated enemies that should have crushed them easily. The key is not to fight the enemy's kind of war, Park explained. You make them fight your kind of war. You drag them down to your level, where their advantages become disadvantages. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a psychologist from Cairo, had been studying the swarm's behavior patterns for months. The swarm learns, but it learns like a very sophisticated computer. It processes information logically, builds predictive models, optimizes responses based on observed data, but there's something it doesn't understand. What's that? Asked Dawnbringer. Spite, Hassan said simply. The human ability to keep fighting, when any rational being would surrender, to take actions that harm ourselves if they also harm our enemies, to choose death over defeat, not because it's logical, but because we're too stubborn to quit. The room erupted in discussion as humans and aliens tried to understand each other's perspectives. The galactic representatives struggled to comprehend tactics that seemed to violate basic principles of survival and efficiency. The humans tried to explain concepts like acceptable losses and calculated risks to species that had spent millennia minimizing both. Finally, Veltar sang a harmony that commanded attention. Even if these tactics could work, how would you implement them? Your ships are barely capable of interplanetary travel. Your weapons cannot penetrate the swarm's outer defenses. Your technology is centuries behind what the swarm has already learned to counter. General Rodriguez grinned. That's the beautiful part, Commander. We don't need advanced technology. We need primitive technology that the swarm has never seen before. He activated a holographic display showing human military history, spears and swords giving way to gunpowder and cannons, which evolved into rifles and artillery, then tanks and aircraft, finally nuclear weapons and guided missiles. Every step of this progression happened because someone found a way to kill their enemies more efficiently. We've been perfecting the art of warfare for 10,000 years, but we never forgot the basics. Sometimes the best way to destroy something is to hit it really hard with a big rock. Dr. Chen pulled up her own displays, showing theoretical weapon designs that made the aliens recoil in horror. Chemical explosives that create massive shockwaves, kinetic kill vehicles that destroy targets through pure momentum, nuclear weapons that release uncontrolled fusion reactions, all things your civilizations abandoned long ago as too dangerous or unpredictable. But that's exactly why they might work, added Dr. Tanaka. The swarm has learned to counter energy. Weapons, quantum disruptors, reality manipulation devices. It's never seen anyone try to solve problems by blowing them up with atomic bombs. The meeting continued for hours as humans and aliens worked together to design a new kind of warfare. Ships that looked like they were held together with hope and determination. Weapons that relied on chemical reactions instead of sophisticated energy systems. Tactics that assumed heavy casualties and considered mission success more important than crew survival. There is one more thing, said Colonel Park as the briefing wound down. We need to be unpredictable not just in our tactics, but in our responses. The swarm will try to learn from every engagement, so we need to make sure that every battle teaches it the wrong lessons. How do we do that? Asked Veltar. By being human, Park replied. By doing things that don't make sense to anyone, including ourselves sometimes. By fighting like we're already dead, and have nothing left to lose. By making the swarm learn to fear something it has never encountered before. What's that, General? Rodriguez answered with a smile that would have terrified any predator in Earth's evolutionary history. Humans with nothing left to lose and a really bad attitude. As the meeting ended and the various representatives returned to their quarters, Veltar found himself alone with Dr. Chen in the briefing room. The crystal being's harmonics were soft with uncertainty. Dr. Chen, may I ask you something? Your people seem eager to fight an enemy that has destroyed civilizations far more advanced than your own. Are you not afraid of what might happen if you fail? Sarah Chen looked at the tactical displays showing the swarm's inexorable advance toward the galaxy's core worlds. She thought about her daughter, who would grow up in a universe where the stars went dark one by one if they failed to stop this threat. Commander Veltar, let me tell you something about humans. We've been afraid of things since we lived in caves and worried about what might be hiding in the dark. Fear is what kept us alive long enough to reach the stars. But there's something we've learned that your people might not understand. What is that? Sometimes the thing you're most afraid of is exactly the thing you need to face head-on. And when you do that often enough, you start to get pretty good at it. The first human fleet launched from Earth's orbital shipyards on a Tuesday morning, while most of the planet below remained unaware that their species was about to join a galactic war. The ships were ugly by galactic standards, looking more like flying construction sites than military vessels. Exposed engines blazed with chemical fire instead of clean antimatter reactions. Weapon systems jutted from the hulls like metal spines. Nothing was streamlined, nothing was elegant, and everything looked like it had been built by someone who cared more about function than form. Admiral Lisa Park stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiance, watching the blue curve of Earth fall away behind them. The ship shuddered and groaned as its massive engines pushed them toward their first engagement with the Void Swarm. In the background, someone had started playing classical music over the ship's communications system. Mozart, she thought, though it was hard to be sure over the mechanical noise. Admiral, we're receiving communication from the Galactic Fleet, reported Lieutenant Commander Torres from the communications station. Commander Veltar is requesting permission to observe our attack on the swarm advanced scouts. Park nodded. Tell him he's welcome to watch, but he should probably stay back. Things are going to get messy. The target was a small swarm detachment that had consumed a mining station in the Proxima system. Intelligence reports said it was a standard scouting force, maybe 50 mechanical units built from the consumed matter of the station and its inhabitants. The Galactic Council had lost 3 fleets trying to destroy similar detachments, each time watching their most advanced warships get torn apart by enemies that learned and adapted faster than anyone could counter. But the humans weren't planning to fight a traditional battle. All ships, this is Admiral Park, she announced over the fleet communications. Remember, we're not trying to outthink these things. We're trying to confuse them so badly they don't know what to think. Stick to the plan, and if the plan stops working, make something up. Human creativity is our best weapon. The human fleet approached the swarm position with all the subtlety of a freight train. No stealth technology, no sophisticated sensor masking, no attempt to achieve tactical surprise. They came in fast and loud, broadcasting everything from death metal to children's lullabies on every frequency they could manage. The swarm noticed them immediately, of course. 50 black shapes detached themselves from the remains of the mining station and moved to intercept. Each swarm unit was the size of a small cruiser, covered in adaptive armor that had learned to deflect every known weapon in the galactic arsenal. Enemy contacts approaching, reported the tactical officer. They're moving in standard intercept formation. Looks like they're trying to analyze our weapon signatures. Good luck with that, Park muttered, then keyed her communicator. All ships engage at will. Operation Sledgehammer is go. What happened next would be studied by military historians for centuries, though most would agree that calling it a battle was generous. The human ships opened fire with weapons that the galactic community had abandoned thousands of years ago. Chemical rockets that relied on controlled explosions to propel chunks of metal at high velocity, nuclear warheads that released their energy in crude, uncontrolled bursts, kinetic kill vehicles that were literally just heavy objects thrown really hard. The swarm's adaptive algorithms tried to process what they were seeing. These weapons were primitive beyond belief, inefficient to the point of being wasteful. They violated every principle of advanced warfare. The swarm began adjusting its defenses based on what its databases said about such archaic technology. Then the humans started improvising. The destroyer Crazy Horse ran out of missiles after the first salvo and switched to ramming attacks using its reinforced bow to punch through swarm units while playing Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries at maximum volume. The crew of the frigate Texas Justice discovered that their ship's waste disposal system could be used to launch anything that fit in the tubes and began firing everything from spare parts to crew members' personal belongings at the enemy. "This is impossible," sang Commander Veltar from his observation ship. "They are using their vessels as weapons. They are turning maintenance equipment into offensive systems. They are..." His harmonics faltered as he watched a human ship literally explode one of its own engines to create a massive shockwave that crippled 3 swarm units. "They are destroying their own ships to damage the enemy." The swarm tried to adapt, but every time it developed a counter-strategy, the humans did something different. Captain Rodriguez of the cruiser Indomitable discovered that swarm units were vulnerable to sustained ramming attacks, so he ordered his crew to rig up a system that let them use escape pods as guided missiles. Lieutenant Kim aboard the Persistence figured out that the swarm's sensors could be overloaded by broadcasting random noise, so she had her communications team start transmitting everything from sports commentary to cooking shows directly at enemy units. But it was Sergeant Martinez who came up with a tactic that changed everything. His squad had been preparing to board a damaged swarm construct when he realized something crucial. The swarm learned from every battle, but it learned by analyzing data. And data could be corrupted. "Admiral, this is boarding Team 7, Martinez's voice crackled over the communications. "We're inside one of the swarm units. These things have processing cores that record everything they encounter. But what if we gave them some bad data to chew on?" "What do you have in mind, Sergeant?" "Well, ma'am, I've got a chainsaw, a lot of thermite charges, and what my grandmother would have called a very bad attitude. I'm thinking I'll see how much chaos I can cause before these things figure out what hit them." What followed could only be described as organized insanity. Human boarding parties equipped with the most primitive tools imaginable swarmed through swarm constructs, causing damage that the enemy's repair systems couldn't categorize or counter. Chainsaws cut through advanced composites that should have been impervious to such crude tools. Thermite charges burned through quantum-locked barriers. And all the while, the humans were laughing. Actually laughing. The swarm's databases had no category for enemies that found combat amusing. Every other species in the galaxy fought with grim determination, careful strategy, or desperate fear. But humans fought like they were having fun. Like this was just another problem to solve with. Whatever tools happened to be handy. "Enemy units are retreating," reported the tactical officer, sounding surprised. "The swarm is pulling back toward the system's edge." Admiral Park watched the black shapes disappear into the darkness between stars, carrying with them data that would confuse swarm algorithms across the galaxy. For the first time in the war against the Void, an enemy force had been not just defeated, but bewildered. "Casualties?" she asked. 17 ships lost or heavily damaged, 347 crew members killed or missing. "The Crazy Horse is going to need a complete rebuild, assuming we can find enough pieces to work with." By galactic standards, the losses were horrific. Any civilized military would have considered the engagement a disaster. But Admiral Park looked at the tactical display showing swarm units in full retreat and smiled. "Not bad for a Tuesday morning," she said. Then, keying her communicator to address the entire fleet. "All ships, this is the Admiral. Good work, people. Now let's go find something bigger to hit." As the human fleet regrouped and prepared for their next engagement, reports of the battle began filtering back to the Galactic Council. The impossible had happened. A primitive species using obsolete technology had defeated the Void Swarm in open combat. The enemy that had seemed unstoppable had been stopped by creatures who thought explosions were a reasonable solution to most problems. But perhaps more disturbing than the victory itself was how the humans had achieved it. They had fought without regard for their own safety, using tactics that bordered on suicidal. They had turned their ships into weapons, their equipment into improvised tools of war. They had laughed while facing an enemy that had terrified the galaxy's greatest civilizations. Commander Veltar sent a message back to the Council that would change everything. "The humans do not fight like any species we have encountered. They do not fight to minimize losses or achieve strategic objectives. They fight like they enjoy it. The swarm cannot adapt to an enemy that treats warfare as entertainment. And in the darkness between stars, swarm processing nodes struggled to analyze data that made no sense. How could creatures survive ramming attacks on their own ships? Why would they use weapons that were demonstrably inferior to available alternatives? What strategic purpose was served by playing music during combat? For the first time in millions of years, the Void Swarm encountered something it could not understand: the human capacity to find joy in chaos, purpose in destruction, and victory in methods that any rational mind would consider insane. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the best way to fight an impossible enemy is to be even more impossible yourself. 6 months after the first human victory against the Void Swarm, the galaxy looked very different. The unstoppable enemy that had consumed star systems for over a year had gone silent. Its massive fleets still lurked in the darkness between stars. But they no longer advanced. They no longer attacked. They simply waited, processing data that refused to make sense. Admiral Lisa Park stood in the council chambers, still wearing her battered fleet uniform instead of the ceremonial robes that other species favored for formal occasions. Around her, representatives from 300 worlds watched with expressions that ranged from gratitude to barely concealed terror. Humanity had saved the galaxy, but in doing so, they had revealed something that made many civilizations deeply uncomfortable. The Void Swarm Core has been dormant for 37 days, reported Supreme Coordinator Thane, the ancient being who had once dismissed Earth as irrelevant. Our deep space monitors detect no movement from their primary fleet. They appear to be thinking. Commander Veltar's crystal body rang with harmonics of amazement. The swarm processes information at quantum speeds. For it to spend over a month analyzing data suggests it has encountered something completely outside its programming. That's the idea, said Admiral Park. We gave it a problem it can't solve: how to fight an enemy that doesn't follow any logical rules. Dawnbringer, the luminary representative, pulsed with nervous energy. But at what cost? Your species has suffered casualties that would be considered catastrophic by any civilized standard. 40% of your fleet destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Over 10,000 dead. How can you call this victory? Park's expression didn't change. Because the alternative was extinction for everyone in this galaxy. And because those 10,000 people died doing what humans do best, making sure the impossible becomes possible. The numbers were staggering, even by human standards. In 6 months of warfare against the Void Swarm, humanity had lost more ships and personnel than most species lost in centuries of conflict. But they had also accomplished something that the galaxy's greatest civilizations had thought impossible. They had made the swarm afraid. Afraid is perhaps not the correct term, corrected Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had been studying swarm behavior patterns for the past month. The swarm doesn't experience fear as we understand it, but it has encountered a variable it cannot predict or control. From its perspective, humans are a logical impossibility that refuses to stop existing. The proof was in the data. After each battle with human forces, swarm units spent increasing amounts of time motionless, their processing cores working overtime to analyze tactics that violated every principle of strategic thinking. They had tried to adapt to human unpredictability, only to discover that adaptation required some degree of pattern recognition. And humans, it turned out, were very good at avoiding patterns. The latest reports from our deep space scouts are interesting, said Colonel James Park, Admiral Park's younger brother and now the head of human intelligence operations. Swarm units are beginning to show signs of what we might call decision paralysis. They start to move toward a target, then stop and recalculate. They begin forming attack patterns, then abort and try different approaches. Some units have been observed moving in circles for hours. Representative Cleeth of the Merchant Guild leaned forward with interest. You mean they're second-guessing themselves? Worse than that, Colonel Park replied. They're second-guessing their second guesses. The swarm was designed to learn and adapt, but human tactics have taught it that any logical response can be wrong, so now it's afraid to respond at all. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever known had been defeated not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through the simple expedient of being so unpredictable that even a hyper-intelligent enemy couldn't cope. But victory had come with a price that went beyond casualty figures. The galactic community was struggling to understand their human allies, and what they learned frightened many of them. "There is another matter we must discuss," said the Supreme Coordinator carefully. "The Council has received numerous requests from member worlds regarding future human involvement in galactic affairs. Some species are concerned about your methods." Admiral Park raised an eyebrow. "Concerned how? Your people treat warfare as if it were a recreational activity," sang Commander Veltar, his harmonics tight with confusion. "You laugh while fighting for your lives. You sacrifice yourselves for strategic advantages that any rational analysis would consider marginal. You use weapons that are as dangerous to yourselves as to your enemies." "And it works," Park pointed out. "Yes, but that's what concerns them," admitted Dawnbringer. "If humans can defeat the Void Swarm using primitive tactics and sheer audacity, what does that say about the value of our advanced civilizations? What happens when you decide that other galactic problems need the same direct approach?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a chemical rocket. Around the chamber, representatives shifted uncomfortably as they contemplated a galaxy where problems were solved not through careful negotiation and technological advancement, but through the application of overwhelming human stubbornness. "Let me make something clear," said Admiral Park, her voice carrying the same steel that had gotten her through 6 months of impossible battles. "Humanity didn't ask to join this war. We were happy on our little backwater world, arguing about politics and building better ways to move things from one place to another. You came to us because your advanced methods weren't working." She gestured to the tactical displays that showed swarm positions throughout the galaxy. "Now you're worried because our primitive methods work too well, because we solved your impossible problem using tools you'd forgotten existed and tactics you'd never consider using." "It's not about the effectiveness of your methods," protested the Supreme Coordinator. "It's about their implications. If every problem can be solved through violent application of force and determination, then maybe," Park interrupted, "you need to reconsider what you think you know about problem solving." Dr. Hassan, the psychologist who had helped design humanity's psychological warfare strategies, stood up from his seat in the observers section. "If I may address the Council, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here about what humans actually bring to galactic civilization." The Supreme Coordinator gestured for him to continue. "You see our methods as primitive and dangerous," Hassan said. "But from our perspective, your methods are cautious to the point of paralysis. You spend centuries analyzing problems that we solve in days. You develop elegant solutions that work perfectly in controlled conditions, but fail when faced with chaos. You've optimized your civilizations for peace and prosperity, which is admirable. But optimization always comes at the cost of adaptability." He activated a holographic display showing human history. "We come from a world where nothing ever went according to plan, where the best-laid strategies fell apart the moment they encountered reality. So we learned to improvise, to adapt, to find solutions using whatever happened to be available. You call it primitive. We call it survival." Commander Veltar's harmonics shifted to something approaching understanding. "You are saying that chaos made you stronger." "I'm saying chaos made us flexible," Hassan replied. "The Void Swarm couldn't adapt to our tactics because our tactics were based on the assumption that any plan can fail. When your strategy depends on being unpredictable, you don't need to worry about the enemy learning your patterns." The debate that followed lasted for hours. Some species called for restrictions on human military activities. Others wanted to study human methods and adapt them for their own use. A few suggested that humanity should be given a permanent seat on the military council, while others worried about what would happen if humans ever decided the council itself needed fixing. Finally, Admiral Park had heard enough. She stood up, her voice cutting through the babble of alien languages and translation harmonics. "Here's what's going to happen," she announced. "Humanity is going to continue doing what we've always done, solving problems using whatever tools work best. Sometimes that means diplomacy and careful negotiation. Sometimes that means hitting things with bigger rocks until they stop being problems." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes and optical sensors of representatives from across the galaxy. "You can work with us, you can try to manage us, or you can go back to solving your own problems the way you always have. But don't expect us to apologize for being effective." The Supreme Coordinator's ancient voice carried a note of resignation. And if we choose to work with you, then you get the benefit of human creativity, human determination, and human willingness to try things that everyone else thinks are impossible. Park smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded everyone present why the Void Swarm had stopped advancing. Plus, we are really good at breaking things that need to be broken. As the session ended and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Commander Veltar approached Admiral Park. His crystal body was singing soft harmonics of curiosity. "Admiral, may I ask you something? Your people have just saved the galaxy, but you show no signs of celebration.